From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane McAuliffe, the director of the John W. Kluge Center, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon to what I know will be one of the most exciting lectures that we will have had in some time. As usual, I'm going to ask you to turn off your cell phones, silence any electronic devices so there are no interruptions, and I'll also alert you to the fact that this lecture is being filmed for future broadcast on the Library of Congress website, as well as on the Kluge Center's YouTube and iTunes channels. Let me say a word about the Kluge Center. We are fundamentally a residential research center in the Library of Congress where we're focused on the support, the showcasing, and the celebration of scholarship. The Kluge Center is the vibrant legacy of a collaboration between the philanthropist John W. Kluge and the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, who I'm delighted is with us this afternoon. Every year we host over 100 senior and junior scholars in residency here at the Kluge Center for prolonged periods of research. We mount dozens of lectures, conferences, and seminars every year. And every few years, we award the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the study of humanity and which we will award in 2015. Next month, we'll celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Kluge Center with a full-day Festival of a Scholarship, which we're calling ScholarFest. For more information about this and other activities at the Kluge Center, I hope you'll go to our website, which has a simple address, loc.gov/Kluge. Today's lecture, as you can see, is entitled Reflections on Issues of Race and Class in 21st Century America, Revisiting Arguments Advanced in the book, The Declining Significance of Race, published in 1978. Our lecturer is, of course, Dr. William Julius Wilson, a distinguished sociologist and current Kluge Chair in American Law and Governance. This lecture is being co-sponsored by the American Sociological Association, and we are very grateful for that co-sponsorship. William Julius Wilson is the Lewis P. and Linda Geiser University Professor at Harvard University. He is one of only 24 university professors, the highest professional distinction for a Harvard faculty member. He's a past president of the American Sociological Association, and his countless honors and awards include a MacArthur Fellowship, 45 honorary degrees, election to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Philosophical Society, and the British Academy. William Julius Wilson is one of America's preeminent thinkers on issues of race, class, and urban inequality. For a generation, his scholarship has brought the most advanced empirical social science to bear on pressing social issues. He has written many books, many important books. Among a few of his titles are the 1987 publication, The Truly Disadvantaged, the Inner City, the Underclass, and Public Policy. 1999, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. In 2006, There Goes the Neighborhood. Perhaps his most famous is the 1978 publication, The Declining Significance of Race. In that volume, Dr. Wilson laid forth the then radical notion that economic class had gradually become more important than race in determining the future life outcomes of African Americans. Race discrimination, he argued, had not disappeared, yet it had been superseded by issues of class, access to housing, and education in the ability of African Americans to escape poverty. In these past months, during his time in residence at the Kluge Center as the Kluge Chair in American Law and Governance, Dr. Wilson has revisited his classic study, and the timing could not be more appropriate, as over the past year, America has once again been forced to confront and examine its understandings of race, justice, and equality in light of events in Ferguson, Staten Island, and Baltimore. It is in the context of these and other events that Dr. Wilson is now reflecting on the themes articulated in his seminal 1978 work and their application to more recent developments in American race and ethnic relations involving not only African Americans, but also other groups, including whites and Latinos. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Julius Wilson.
Thank you very much, Jane. It really is a distinct honor to deliver a public lecture at the Library of Congress. And I would like to thank Dr. James Billington, the librarian, and Dr. Carolyn Brown, former director of the Kluge Center, for inviting me to become a scholar in residence at the Kluge Center that Jane described very well, and to deliver today's lecture. I would also like to thank Jane, current director of the Kluge Center, as she said, and her wonderful staff for making my stay so comfortable and productive. You know, despite an exceedingly hectic schedule this spring, I was able to accomplish a lot, including completing the research for this lecture, which, to repeat the title, Reflections on Issues of Race and Class in 21st Century America, Revisiting Arguments Advanced in the Declining Significance of Race, first published in 1978. By the way, I have to correct you on one thing, Jane. My most famous book is A Truly Disadvantaged, which has something like 14,000 citations. Okay. Now, I'm sorry to correct you, but I had to do that. Okay. The Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies has just published a symposium on my book. I think it just came out, online this week, on my book, The Declining Significance of Race. And I had the opportunity to respond to several thoughtful reflections on the book 37 years after its initial publication. And I therefore thought it would be more than appropriate to include in my presentation today parts of my rejoinder to the papers in that symposium. The title, The Declining Significance of Race, lends itself to misinterpretation among those who have either not read the book or not read it carefully. For such readers, as I pointed out in the book's third edition, published in 2012, the title conveys an optimistic view of American race relations and doesn't reflect the book's pessimistic tone about the conditions and future of poor blacks. And I'm reminded in this connection of a call I received from the White House shortly after Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. And the caller said, Professor Wilson, we would like to invite you to join other black conservatives in a meeting with President Reagan. And I said, where did you get the idea that I am a black conservative? And he said, well, you're on our list. And I said, take me off that list. So to repeat, you see, the title is misleading. Also, as University of Miami sociologist George Wilson notes in the symposium, many of the studies whose titles play off the phrase, the declining significance of race, do not even acknowledge or attempt to address the two major underlying themes of the book. One, the effect of fundamental economic and political shifts on the changing relative importance of race and class in the life trajectories of African Americans. And two, the swing in the concentration of racial conflict from the economic sector to the socio-political order. Now, in sharp contrast to many earlier studies, the articles in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium include a careful discussion of these two major themes. And I reflect on this discussion in my presentation today, which will also relate the two major themes to more recent developments in American race and ethnic relations, featuring other groups, including whites and Latinos, as well as advance some thoughts on the future of race relations in the United States. Several of the participants in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium highlight the declining significance of race's theoretical framework, relating racial issues to the changing economic and political arrangements of society. As Harvard sociologist Matthew Desmond put it, and I quote, the central thrust of the book has to do with the fundamental ways that large-scale transformations in economic and political institutions brought about the historic decoupling of race from class in the African American experience, unquote. Moreover, University of Michigan sociologist Karen Lacey highlights the book's historical analysis of the relationship between changing societal institutions and black social mobility. And Texas A&M sociologist Arthur Sakamoto indicates that the declining significance of race identified emerging technological advances associated with communication and transportation, which have now become increasingly globalized and have even more profound impact on low-skilled workers, including poor African American workers. The focus on economic transformations provides a backdrop for my analysis of the changing role of race and class in determining black life chances. As George Wilson appropriately observes in the symposium, in the declining significance of race, occupational mobility and job placement are more directly related to life chances. And beginning in the last few decades of the 20th century, the economic and social conditions of the black poor deteriorated, while those of the black middle class improved. Indeed, as Matthew Desmond emphasized, in many respects, the conditions of poor African Americans are worse now than when the first edition of The Declining Significance of Race was published almost 4 decades ago. In the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium, political scientists Jennifer Hochschild of Harvard and Wisla Weaver of Yale provide a comprehensive discussion of the widening gap between the haves and have-nots in the Black community that lends support to this pessimistic conclusion. First of all, their analysis of data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress reveals that the test score disparity between Black and white students with well-educated parents versus those with poorly educated parents, quote, was greater in 2012 than it had been in 1978, where the focus was on math, or 1980 when it was on reading, leading to the conclusion that, quote, the educationally best off are becoming educationally better off at a faster rate than are the worse off who are stagnating or even losing ground, unquote. Second, they draw upon U.S. Census data using the Gini ratio and demonstrate that income inequality is now greater among Blacks than any other group. And I examined the same government documents and present the findings in Figure 1. The Gini ratio measures the extent to which the actual income distribution of a particular group deviates from a hypothetical distribution in which each household of the group receives an equal proportion of total group income. The measure ranges from 0, perfect equality, to 1, maximum inequality. Now, this figure discloses the increasing household income inequality across the American population as a whole. Beginning there, the line begins in 1970 for all races. From a low of 0.39 in 1970 to 0.48 in 2013. More important, however, is the high level of intra-group inequality among Black households. Although the absolute level of Black income is well below that of whites, Blacks nonetheless display the most intra-group income inequality, reaching a household Gini index of 0.49 in 2013, followed by whites at 0.47 and Hispanics at 0.45. Now, research reveals that income inequality is related to income segregation. Figure 2 presents data on income segregation by race in metropolitan areas with populations of more than 500,000. The source for this figure is a study by Kendra Bischoff and Sean Reardon, a study to which Hochschild and Weaver refer in this symposium. Now, this figure, Figure 2, reveals that income segregation has grown rapidly in the last decade, and particularly among Blacks and Hispanic families. And what is notable, and this is quite remarkable, is that whereas African American families in 1970, what color is that graph there for African Americans? Purple? Is it purple there? Well, whatever. You could see the African Americans are high. Whereas African American families in 1970 recorded the least income segregation. Notice that. the least income segregation in 1970, they now register the highest income segregation. Now, please note that we are talking here about residential segregation among black families of different income levels, not segregation between black and white families. And another way of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which the exposure of families to neighbors of the same race has changed over time. Now, although income segregation among black families grew considerably in the 1970s and 1980s, it grew even more rapidly from 2000 to 2009 after slightly declining in the 1990s. And when considering a person's life trajectory or life chances, the differences in the quality of one's daily life between residing in a predominantly affluent neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood are huge. And it is important to note that today, poor black families have fewer middle-class neighbors than they had in 1970. Now, when income segregation is coupled with racial segregation, low-income blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages along several dimensions, including joblessness, educational attainment, and family structure. On this point, Hochschild and Weaver state, quote, "To choose only one important indicator, in 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were only slightly more likely than comparable but better off blacks to be victims of violent crime, about 45 and 38 per 1,000 people, respectively. By 2008, however, poor blacks were much more likely to be crime victims, about 75 per 1,000, while affluent blacks were less likely to be crime victims, about 23 per 1,000, unquote. Now, how do we explain the rapid growth in income segregation among black families? Well, in the 1970s and 1980s, the rise of black family income segregation may have been related to changes in housing legislation and increased black suburbanization, as well as the rise of a more substantial black middle class, which is partly reflected in increased income inequality. However, another possible explanation for the sharp growth in black income segregation in the 2000s is a lenient mortgage lending practices that were common in the early part of the first decade of this century. As Bischoff and Reardon point out, quote, "These practices provided many moderate income families with increased access to home ownership and therefore may have increased the residential distance between low and middle income families," unquote. And finally, Karen Lacey of the University of Michigan provides another perspective in support of the pessimistic conclusion that the conditions of poor African Americans are worse now than when the first edition of The Declining Significance of Race was published in 1978. And in the symposium, reflecting on my argument, and I'm quoting from my own book now, the economic and political systems in the United States have demonstrated remarkable flexibility in allowing talented blacks to fill positions of prestige and influence. At the same time, these systems have shown persistent rigidity in handling the problems of lower class blacks, unquote. She points out that actions by the Supreme Court and federal and local governments in recent years have made it more difficult for the poor, including, of course, poor blacks, to improve or even maintain their socioeconomic position. The power and negotiation position of labor unions have weakened. Calls to substantially raise the minimum wage, whose real dollar value has eroded during the past several decades, have been resisted. The criteria of welfare eligibility have toughened. Employment opportunities in the public sector have waned. And penalties for financial instability, including interest rates for excessive credit card debt, have become more severe. Quote, while institutions punish the poor for their poverty status, unquote, states Lacey, quote, higher income people are rewarded for their success, unquote, as revealed in a dramatic decline in their earned income tax rate and capital gains tax. So, despite the continuing interracial disparities, as authors in this symposium indicate, the socioeconomic gap between better-off blacks, including the college-educated, and poor blacks is wide and growing. However, in order to keep things in perspective, in proper perspective, it is important not to overlook the continuing interracial disparities. For example, a report from the Center of Economic and Policy Research reveals that before the Great Recession, there was only a 1.4 percentage point difference in the unemployment gap between recent black and white college graduates, aged 22 to 27. However, in 2013, shortly after the economic downturn, the gap had surged to a 7.5 percentage point difference. Now, race is obviously a factor at play, because historically, the periods during and immediately after downturns have adversely impacted blacks more than whites. However, the issues involving race in these intergroup comparisons are complex. For example, aside from the role of racial discrimination, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges, and therefore have an edge when employers rely on such criteria, especially during slack labor markets, that is, periods of higher unemployment. Moreover, there has been even though there has been greater income segregation among black families, middle-class black families tend to live in areas with a much higher percentage of low-income families than do comparable white families. Racial differences in wealth helps to explain some of these patterns. Because white families have greater average wealth than black families, they are more likely to afford housing in higher income neighborhoods. The Pew Research Center recently released data showing that the median financial wealth of white households in 2012 exceeded that of black households by almost $134,000. So, despite increases in income inequality and income segregation among blacks, the interracial disparities between blacks and whites remain huge and must always be kept in mind when discussing and highlighting growing intra-racial differences. Are you still with me? Now, as noted previously, one of the two major underlying themes of the declining significance of race is that the center of racial conflict tension has shifted from the economic sector to the sociopolitical order. I argued in the book that neither the low-wage sector nor the corporate and government sectors provide the basis for the sort of interracial job competition and conflict that beset the economic order in previous years. Today, I argued, racial tensions and conflicts have more to do with competition for and access to residential areas, public schools, and municipal political systems than with competition for jobs. Well, none of the authors in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium take issue with these basic arguments. For example, Matthew Desmond states, quote, "The declining significance of race also reaches beyond an economic determinist perspective by concluding that racial antagonism no longer is primarily a product of struggles over work and wages. In that way, it anticipated the emergence of different institutions that would come to have a profound influence on American race relations," unquote. And he cites studies that provide detailed discussions of these institutions and their impact on the African American community, including studies on the uneven distribution of concentrated disadvantage and violence in neighborhoods, the reproduction of racial inequality in public schools, the criminal justice system and its prisons, race and class conflicts in municipal politics, techniques of resource extraction in housing markets, and the public sector's frayed safety net. The arguments by the authors in this symposium make clear what is often ignored or overlooked in many of the studies that responded to the declining significance of race. Namely, the book's original argument was not that race is no longer significant or that racial barriers between blacks and whites have been eliminated. Rather, in comparing the contemporary situation of African Americans to their situation in the past, the diverging experiences of blacks along class lines and shifting concentration of racial tension from the economic sector to the socio-political order indicate that race, although still very salient, has a lesser effect today than economic class in determining blacks' life trajectories. But does this argument apply to other groups? According to Sakamoto in the symposium, quote, "A careful reading of the declining significance of race shows that it foretells the rapid rise in class inequality that is now generally recognized to have become a major political issue," unquote. As Hochschild and Weaver put it, quote, "The significance of class is increasing in the United States in the sense that economic inequality is rising within the Black and Latino populations as well as among whites," unquote. And I would like to extend these arguments by briefly discussing two important books, and I say brief, just recently published, which present and discuss data related to aspects of the two major underlying themes of the declining significance of race. One book is by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam, entitled "Our Kids: The American Dream in Crisis." And the other is by the political scientists Marisa Abrajano and Zoltan Hojnal, entitled White Backlash: Immigration, Race, and American Politics. Putnam's book focuses on the changing relative importance of race and class in America, and Abrajano and Hojnal's book highlight the growing racial ethnic conflict in the political arena. I begin with a brief discussion of Putnam's book. According to Putnam, although racial barriers to success remain powerful, they represent less burdensome impediments than they did in the 1950s. By contrast, class barriers in America today loom much larger than they did back then. And this is reflected not only in growing income inequality among all racial and ethnic groups, but also increasing disparities in many other aspects of well-being: accumulated wealth, class segregation across neighborhoods, quality of primary and secondary education, enrollment in highly selective colleges, and even life expectancy. Abrajano and Hojnal's book reveals that whereas in the past, individual policy preferences in the United States have been shaped, at least at some point, by antagonisms toward blacks, white Americans' mounting concerns about immigration, they argued, have exacerbated the racial divide. The movement of white Americans, especially those in the South, from the Democratic to the Republican Party in the last several decades, in response to the civil rights movement, has recently accelerated due to concerns about immigration, especially Latino immigration. In other words, whereas in the past, racial tensions were typically driven by a black-white dynamic, Abrajano and Hojnal argue that this is less true today. The dynamics of race, they argue, have been fundamentally restructured by the increasing visibility of Latinos. Thus, whereas growing class inequality has become a characteristic feature of American life in general, the data presented by Abrajano and Hojnal suggests that race has unseated class as the main dividing line in U.S. politics. Now, as I reflect on the powerful arguments in these two books, I conclude that the first underlying theme of the declining significance of race, the changing relative significance of race and class on one's life trajectory, has been extended to all U.S. racial and ethnic groups in Putnam's book. And Abrajano and Hojnal provide data on one increasingly important aspect of the second major underlying theme, the growing racial divide in U.S. politics. But what does this discussion suggest for the future of race relations in the United States? And as I think about this question, I am reminded of Richard Alba's important book, Blurring the Color Line, published in 2009. Alba feels that it is a mistake, and I quote him, to view our current ethno-racial inequalities as enduring, unquote. His complex arguments in support of this view are based on his historical analysis of three conditions associated with the decisive mass-scale assimilation of Irish Catholics and the descendants of Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as the rise of Asian Americans after World War II. The first condition is what he calls non-zero-sum mobility, non-zero-sum mobility, which occurs when the gains of lower status disadvantaged groups do not come at the expense of more advantaged groups. The second condition, which must work in tandem with non-zero-sum mobility, is the ability of less privileged groups to convert their socioeconomic advancement into social proximity with the dominant group, mainly through residential integration. Under such conditions, the children of less privileged groups are more able to gain access to spatially based resources such as good schools and develop the social skills, interracial and or interethnic friendships that contribute to success in mainstream settings when they reach adulthood. And the third condition is the emergence of a progressive ideology that effectively promotes equality of opportunity. Now, Alba envisions a similar unfolding of conditions in the 21st century that could effectively erode the rigid racial boundaries disadvantaging African Americans and Latinos. And he argues that the retirement of members of the massive baby boom generation, who are heavily white, well-educated, and are disproportionately represented in the best-paying occupations, quote, could open up the labor market in a way that has not been true since the middle of the 20th century, unquote. Now, in this connection, we should be reminded that beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, the economy in the United States shifted from an industrial manufacturing-based system to a post-industrial economy defined by services and consumption. And this shift has resulted in what social scientists describe as an hourglass-shaped economy that we see today. An economy featuring many high-wage jobs at the top, many low-wage jobs at the bottom, but a spectacular loss of median-wage jobs in the middle. It is a growth of high-wage jobs at the top that is the focus of Alba's analysis. And Alba maintains that when we look across cohorts today, we see a greater penetration of African Americans and Hispanics entering the labor market into top decile and other top quartile positions. Because of this increased ethno-racial diversity near the top, many whites, he argues, now interact with minorities who are their peers in these positions. However, despite the special significance of non-zero-sum mobility for ethno-racial boundary change, there are certain contingencies that could change this scenario for African Americans and Hispanics in the next several decades. Contingencies that Alba carefully assesses in reaching his ultimate conclusions about the possibility of a more integrated America. And I would like to consider carefully two of the contingencies he mentioned. First, the United States could resort to recruiting trained immigrants from other countries to fill jobs requiring higher levels of qualification. However, Alba proclaims that the United States will increasingly have to compete with other countries around the world for highly skilled immigrants, countries like Germany, Italy, and Spain, whose fertility levels have been well below job replacement levels in recent years. and the source of highly trained workers from foreign student populations will be limited in the United States due to the difficulties in obtaining student visas in the post-9/11 era, as well as the aggressive and increasingly successful recruitment of international students by European universities. Moreover, he argues, it is reasonable to expect that India and China could take steps to retain their highly skilled nationals if and when they reach certain points of economic development and demographic shift. Second, although non-zero-sum mobility would open up higher-paying positions that could be filled by minorities, the expansion of opportunities would enable white women and working-class white males to move into these positions in significantly higher numbers. However, Alba believes neither can satisfy the demand for highly skilled workers in the next several decades. The cohort of whites, quote, that will come of age during the next 25 years are notably smaller than are the white baby boomers they will replace, unquote. And, quote, it would take something close to a revolution in the arrangements currently governing domestic life and the raising of children to unleash fully the working power of women, unquote. I don't see any of you smiling at that one. Nonetheless, the severest challenge to Alba's thesis remains, namely, the extent to which African Americans and Hispanics are able to take advantage of the opportunities for non-zero-sum mobility given their lagging post-secondary educational attainments. In addressing this problem, let's not forget the two other conditions that led to the relaxation of ethnic boundaries in the mid-20th century, and consider the likelihood that each, along with non-zero-sum mobility, could be reproduced in the next quarter century for less privileged groups of color. One, gaining access to spatially based resources, such as good schools, through residential integration. And two, the emergence of a progressive ideology that effectively promotes equality of opportunity. Now, if non-zero-sum mobility does emerge in the next quarter century, the conditions associated with the removal of racial ethnic group competition would be favorable for the emergence and acceptance of a more progressive ideology of equality of opportunity as applied to Hispanics, African Americans, and other groups of color. However, there is little reason to assume that African Americans will experience residential integration on a mass scale in the next few decades, and that's putting it mildly. Now, Alba is fully aware of the magnitude of the enduring problem stemming from racial segregation. He therefore calls for a greater national investment in education, as well as effective program of affirmative action. Let me first focus on a need for affirmative action in a period of non-zero-sum mobility. Research suggests that the white backlash against racial entitlements, such as affirmative action, contributed to the government's retreat from anti-discrimination policies during the 1980s. It should not be surprising that waning support for affirmative action programs would have an adverse effect on African Americans in particular. For example, a number of empirical studies have revealed significant differences in the family environment and neighborhood environment of blacks and whites that are understated when standard measures of socioeconomic status are employed. Take, for example, the question of family background. Even when white parents and black parents report the same average income, white parents have substantially more assets than do black parents. And as I pointed out previously, whites with the same schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges. Furthermore, children's test scores are associated not only with the social and economic status of their parents, but they are also affected by the social and economic status of their grandparents. This means that it could take several generations before adjustments in socioeconomic inequality produce their full benefits. Thus, if we were to rely solely on the standard criteria for college admission, like SAT scores, even many children from black middle-income families would be denied admission in favor of middle-income whites who are not weighed down by the accumulation of disadvantages that stem from racial restrictions and who therefore tend to score higher on these conventional tests. For all of these reasons, the success of younger educated blacks remains heavily dependent on affirmative action programs, whereby more flexible criteria are used to gauge potential to succeed. Now, Alba is absolutely on the mark when he emphasizes the importance of affirmative action. And considering the fact that under conditions of non-zero-sum mobility, the advancement of trained and educated minorities is less threatening to the members of the dominant group because such mobility does not adversely affect their life chances, affirmative action programs, especially those that emphasize flexible criteria of evaluation to gauge a person's potential to succeed, will be more readily accepted. The policy implications are obvious. Race-specific policies like affirmative action will be required for the foreseeable future, even under conditions of non-zero-sum mobility, to ensure the continued mobility of educated blacks. But affirmative action programs are not really designed to address the problems of the most disadvantaged and poorest minorities, especially those who live in impoverished inner-city ghettos. Accordingly, if we are beginning a period of non-zero-sum mobility, the minority individuals who are most likely to benefit will be those who are trained and educated, those who have the qualifications to enter the higher echelons of the labor market, whether directly or via affirmative action programs. Now, Alba recognizes that, quote, the scenario of ethno-racial change coupled to non-zero-sum mobility will not help the minority poor very much, unquote. And that is why he has called for greater investment in educational institutions and for programs that provide greater opportunity for occupational mobility in lieu of an effective long-range program of residential integration so that, so that youngsters who have been raised in poor families and have grown up in poor neighborhoods will improve their chances in life. Now, to his credit, Alba also recognizes that a reduction of such impoverishment will call for income redistribution through tax and welfare policies and with greater public investment to improve communities where the poor reside and the institutions that serve them, unquote. But for the foreseeable future, especially given the present political climate, only the most optimistic observers would anticipate that such a program would receive the necessary public and political support. Thus, if Alba's compelling arguments are indeed correct, the new chance for a more integrated America will largely apply to the more privileged people of color, not the minority poor. Thank you. Jane tells me that I have about 5 or 10 minutes to take some questions. So, far away. Yes, sir.
So, just an observation. I don't know if it's a question or not, but growing up in the 60s, what I saw happen was America paying extraordinary attention to, in particular, African Americans with great gifts. And those, that 1% or lower, were given all sorts of opportunities and privileges, especially as far as education was concerned. And those who were with more modest gifts, they just, I feel, just continued to catch hell. And I believe that the divergence began there and has continued. Some went off to the finest institutions, a very small percentage, and the rest in the 60s, those who should have gone to good institutions, went to Vietnam. And at that point, the black community began to fall apart, in my view.
My work supports that general observation. Thank you, sir. I agree. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the emphasis on culture, and particularly notions of a culture of poverty in debates, and how culture used to be something that the left emphasized, and it seems like a lot of people on the right like to talk about it now.
Well, let me just say that culture has also become a topic of research among people on the left, the more liberal folks as well. There's no longer the sort of knee-jerk reaction that it's structure and not culture. So culture is receiving very special attention, and there really have been some important studies that have come out that discuss reactions. For example, if you focus on the black community, reactions to chronic economic and racial subordination. Certain cultural traits emerge as people adapt to or adjust to these conditions. Worldviews developed that reflect experiences that people undergo. And people end up developing a sense of how the world works based on their own experiences. That's culture. And they make decisions based on those experiences. Now, the big difference between conservatives and liberals is conservatives tend to conclude that the culture is so deeply embedded. I won't say this is true of all conservatives, but this is certainly a view of many conservatives, that cultural traits have become so deeply embedded that even if you open up opportunities, people will not respond. You see, liberals reject that argument and say you open up opportunities and you will see significant changes in behavior. And a lot of us, I'm a liberal, I must say, despite being invited to meet Reagan, a lot of us talk about the Harlem Children's Zone as an example of what I'm talking about. That's an amazing program. I don't know how many of you people are familiar with the Harlem Children's Zone. It was developed by the visionary Geoffrey Canada, whose mission was to flood a number of blocks in Harlem with educational, social, and medical services to create a comprehensive safety net for the children in the area. And it's been a very, very successful program. He was able to get corporate leaders to support him. I don't have an exact figure on how much money he has amassed, but the Harlem Children's Zone has, in 1990, it had nearly $2 million in assets and a fiscal year budget of roughly 84 or 85 million dollars. And the kids in that program who are lucky enough to enter that program, I could go on and on, have really been successful. And here's what, this is a great example of what happens when you open up opportunities for kids who are generally sort of forgotten about. You think about this. You should not be able to walk into a hospital ward, inner city hospital ward, and look at newborn babies and predict fairly precisely where they're going to end up in life. That shows our society is very unequal. The Harlem Children's Zone rescues these kids, and it's been a very successful program. And I should point out that, President Obama patterned his promised neighborhoods after the Harlem Children's Zone. Unfortunately, the program was severely cut in the budget by Congress, but that's an example that we like to use.
Thank you very much for your talk. Could you say anything about any gender differences within the different communities? I'm thinking in terms of employment opportunities or constraints for black women compared to black men, and if there's a significant difference between the races along the gender lines?
Yes, there are significant differences in many ways. Significant differences in high school completion. Black males have a much higher high school dropout. Significant differences in employment rate. Black women, particularly those poor blacks who are in the service sector looking for jobs, find it a lot easier to land a position. And one reason for that is that employers have this sort of perception of black males that they are threatening and dangerous. And in the service sector, employees come in contact with the public. They have to interact with the public. In previous years, black males working in factories, all they needed were muscles and a strong back. Now they need a personality, and they have to relate to people. They have to have soft skills, if you will. And employers feel that these guys don't have these skills, and they won't hire them if there is a slack labor market. That is to say, if you have relatively high unemployment. Black women are probably preferred over white women, and here I'm basing this on a study we did in Chicago of employers of entry-level positions. We interviewed them, and they said they have no hesitation of hiring black women, but they do have great hesitation in hiring low-skilled black males. And some of these black males, in response to lack of opportunity, predictably turn to crime. And then they end up with a prison record, and then they're stigmatized, and they have no chance of finding a job once they have a prison record. Particularly in this day and age when all you need to do is go online and look, everything is computerized. I mean, you can get all kinds of information immediately on a person's background and record. Yes, I'm sorry, there's 3 hands up here, go ahead. Right.
In addition to the question of disparity between what you might call the underclass and the more affluent blacks, could you give us an idea of the actual numbers or proportions today compared to 1978 when you wrote your book? In other words, to what extent has the underclass actually grown as opposed to its comparison?
That's a great question. I wish I could answer it. And I'm being taped. I'm not going to go online and throw out a figure when I haven't gone back and review it and investigated, examined the figures and data. All I will say is this. Those blacks who live below the poverty line are in worse shape than they were when I wrote The Declining Significance of Race. The extent to which that group has grown, I can't say. I will say this, without giving you any exact figures. There is an increasing number of working class blacks and lower middle class blacks and working class whites and lower middle class whites who are slipping downward in this hourglass economy. Go ahead. Okay, all right.
Dr. Wilson, currently the Obama administration has started Brothers Keepers and the other cultural divide that you talked about. How do you tie that in to what is going on with black males in our cities in recent days, months?
The program, My Brother's Keeper, is very timely, and I applaud the Obama administration for initiating this program. The problem is that it's underfunded. Now, there's a consortium of, government agencies and private businesses working together to address the problems of young black males. But the problems are overwhelming. And I just wish that there were more funds available. It's the right program, but severely underfunded. Now, I should point out this. I fight pessimism all the time. You don't want to wallow in pessimism. But it's hard to be optimistic about the conditions or future of young black males, particularly these high school dropouts. What chance do they have in this economy to succeed? What chance? And these confrontations with the police, it's too simplistic to simply say it's race or racism. Sure, race and racism are involved in some of these incidents. But the conditions have created a situation where there are a number of poorly trained young black males who have absolutely no future and therefore are very vulnerable and are angry and are likely to get involved in these entanglements. And I should also point out to you that my colleague at Harvard, Phil Goff, has done some interesting research on policing behavior and black males. And you know what's the best predictor of police violence toward black males? Not racism. Masculinity threat. Macho. And this probably explains why, that some of these black police officers are hitting these guys over the head, or involved in unnecessary violence. But to repeat, the situation is really, go back to your question. My Brother's Keeper is an important program. I just wish it were had more funding.
Bill. Over here. Bill.
Okay.
Professor Wilson.
Hey, hi, Leslie.
To what extent
One of my former students at the University of Chicago.
proudly, to what extent do you think Nixon's retrenchment from integrated schooling and the Bakke decision may have affected this trend of downward spiraling for blacks in terms of education?
So you're associating the Bakke decision with You're talking about the Alan Bakke case?
Yes.
Yeah, could you elaborate? Leslie, I don't see the connection. Yeah, go ahead. You want to elaborate over?
It's just the era in which Nixon retrenched from integrated schooling in general at the lower levels and access for minorities.
Well, I don't think that's so much was the outcome was so much due to government action as the sort of the de facto segregation occurring in schools. There wasn't de jure segregation, just de facto segregation that's related to any number of things, including racial segregation in the neighborhoods. Can I just make one point? Never mind. It's time to wrap it up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I promised you a particularly splendid lecture this afternoon, and I'm sure that promise was fulfilled. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. This was terrific. And I'd like to ask the entire audience to join us for a reception now. Thank you for being here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.